I remember the exact moment my family realized I had given them exactly what they wanted, and it happened the second the lawyer stopped reading my will and looked up with that strange expression on his face, the kind that makes an entire room go quiet without anyone saying a word. My name is Margaret Whitmore, I'm 72 years old, and the house everyone was fighting over that afternoon is the same house my husband and I bought 43 years ago for $89,000 on a quiet street outside Columbus, Ohio. Back then it was just a modest two-story place with creaky hardwood floors, a small porch, and a maple tree in the yard that my husband planted the week we moved in. We raised our son Daniel in that house, celebrated every Thanksgiving there, watched the maple tree grow taller than the roofline, and I truly believed that one day the home would carry the same meaning for him that it did for me. But somewhere along the way, the meaning of that house changed for my family. For me, it was memories. For them, it became numbers. The first time I noticed it was about 6 years ago, not long after Daniel married his wife Vanessa. She was charming when we first met, the kind of woman who hugged you quickly and called you mom before you even got used to hearing her voice. At first I thought Daniel had chosen well. Vanessa laughed easily, complimented my cooking, and told everyone how lucky she felt to marry into our family. But small things started happening that I couldn't ignore. One Sunday afternoon she walked slowly through my living room holding her phone out like she was measuring something, pointing the camera at the walls and windows. When I asked what she was doing, she smiled and said she was just curious about the layout. A few months later she asked Daniel, right in front of me, how much houses on this street were selling for lately. I remember the way she said it, casually, like it was harmless conversation, but Daniel pulled up listings on his phone within seconds. That was the moment I realized something had shifted. They weren't looking at my home the way I did. They were looking at square footage, resale value, and the rising prices in our neighborhood. Over the next few years the comments became more frequent. Vanessa once joked that the kitchen would look amazing after a renovation, and Daniel nodded as if he already owned the place. Another time I overheard them in the hallway talking about how quiet the neighborhood would be once everything eventually became theirs. They thought I couldn't hear them. They thought I wasn't paying attention. What they didn't realize was that every word, every glance at the walls, every whispered plan slowly changed the way I saw them. And that's when I started thinking about the promise I would one day write into my will, a promise that sounded generous on the surface but carried a meaning they never once considered. Because if there's one thing I've learned in 72 years, it's that when people become obsessed with getting exactly what they want, they rarely stop to ask what might come with it. For a long time I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that maybe I was simply becoming sensitive with age, the way people sometimes warn you about when you pass 70, but deep down I knew exactly what I was hearing and seeing inside my own home. Daniel had not always been like that. When he was a boy he used to run through the yard under that tall maple tree, dragging a red plastic wagon behind him and asking his father 100 questions about how the world worked. My husband, Richard, had been a patient man who believed that hard work and kindness would always lead to a good life. He worked 34 years at the same manufacturing company outside Columbus, leaving the house every morning at 6:30 with a travel mug of coffee and returning home just before dinner with sawdust sometimes still clinging to his sleeves. Together we built our life carefully, dollar by dollar, month by month. When we bought the house the interest rate on our mortgage was over 9%, and I remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night with a calculator making sure we could afford every payment. We were never wealthy, but we were steady. Daniel grew up watching that stability, watching how his father fixed the fence himself instead of hiring someone and how we saved for years before replacing the roof. After Richard passed away 12 years ago, the house became quieter but it also became the place where I felt closest to him. Every room carried a memory. The porch swing where we drank iced tea during Ohio summers. The narrow hallway where Daniel measured his height every birthday. The garage where Richard kept his old toolbox lined up on a wooden shelf. For many years Daniel respected that. He visited often, brought groceries when he thought I needed help, and sat with me at the kitchen table talking about work and life. But after Vanessa came into the picture, something subtle began to change. It was never a dramatic shift at first. It was the small comments that kept repeating themselves like background noise. Vanessa would say things like how large the backyard was compared to newer homes, or how houses in this neighborhood had nearly doubled in price over the last decade. She had a way of speaking about my home as if it were already a future investment instead of the place where I still lived every day. Daniel began agreeing with her more and more. Sometimes he would mention how selling a property like this could fund early retirement or help them travel more. They said these things casually, often while standing in the same kitchen where I had spent 40 years cooking dinners for my family. One evening about 3 years ago, I was in the hallway when I heard Vanessa speaking quietly to Daniel in the living room. She was not whispering because she wanted privacy. She was whispering because she believed I had gone upstairs already. She said that once the house eventually belonged to them, they could remodel the interior, open the kitchen wall, and maybe even flip the property while the market was strong. Daniel did not argue with her. In fact, he laughed softly and said it would be the smartest financial move they could make. I stood there in the hallway listening to my own home being discussed like a future transaction, and in that quiet moment I realized something important. They were already planning their lives around the day this house would become theirs. They just never expected that I might still have a few plans of my own. I began paying closer attention after that night in the hallway. Not because I wanted to spy on my own family, but because once you hear something like that, you cannot simply pretend you did not. Over the next year, the pattern became clearer than I ever expected. Vanessa started bringing up the house during conversations that had nothing to do with it. If we were having coffee at the kitchen table, she would casually mention how homes with 4 bedrooms were becoming rare in older neighborhoods like mine. If Daniel came over to fix something small, like replacing the light fixture above the porch, Vanessa would follow him through the rooms and comment on what could be improved. She once stood in the doorway of the dining room and said that if the wall between the dining room and the kitchen were removed, it would create a beautiful open concept space. I remember smiling politely while she talked, but inside I felt something strange settle in my chest. It was not anger at first. It was more like the slow realization that I was becoming a temporary guest in the place I had built my entire life around. Daniel began repeating some of the same language she used. One afternoon he mentioned that the property value in my neighborhood had climbed to nearly $400,000 for homes similar to mine. He said it in a thoughtful voice, the way someone discusses a promising investment. When I asked him how he knew that number so precisely, he pulled out his phone and showed me several real estate listings within half a mile of my address. He scrolled through photographs of houses that looked almost identical to mine and talked about market trends while sitting at the same table where he used to do his elementary school homework. I noticed something else during that time as well. They had begun talking about the future as though a certain step in the timeline had already been decided. Vanessa once said that when the house eventually belonged to them, they could rent it for passive income or possibly sell it to buy a larger place outside the city. She spoke about it with the kind of calm confidence people use when discussing plans that feel guaranteed. What surprised me most was that neither of them ever asked how I felt about any of it. The conversations always floated around me instead of including me, as if my role in the situation was simply to exist quietly until the inevitable transfer of ownership happened. The more I listened, the more I realized something important. They were not being openly cruel. They were simply comfortable. Comfortable enough to assume that time would take care of everything for them. Comfortable enough to forget that the woman who owned the house was still sitting in the same room. That was when a small idea began forming in the back of my mind, an idea that grew clearer every time I heard them discussing square footage or resale value. If they were so certain about what the future would bring them, perhaps the most memorable lesson I could give them was to let that certainty carry them all the way to the very moment when the truth finally arrived. I did not say anything about those conversations for a long time because sometimes silence teaches you more about people than confrontation ever could. Instead, I watched, I listened, and I waited. The turning point came during a Sunday dinner that Vanessa insisted on hosting at my house about 2 years ago. She said it would be easier since my kitchen was larger and everyone already felt comfortable there. I remember standing by the stove stirring a pot of soup while the smell of roasted chicken filled the room, and for a moment the evening almost felt like the family gatherings we used to have when Richard was still alive. Daniel sat at the table scrolling through something on his phone while Vanessa walked around the kitchen with the kind of casual confidence that suggested she already imagined herself living there. After we finished eating, she leaned back in her chair and looked around the room slowly, the way someone studies a property they are thinking about buying. Then she said something that made the entire evening shift in a way she probably never intended. She said that this house had so much potential if it were updated properly and that it could easily sell for over $450,000 with the right renovations. Daniel nodded while she spoke and added that older homes like this were becoming very desirable in our area. At first I thought they were simply continuing the same type of conversations I had heard before, but then Vanessa said something more direct. She suggested that it might make sense for me to start thinking about downsizing sometime soon. She mentioned how many communities in Ohio offered beautiful retirement living options where maintenance was taken care of and everything was designed to be easier for older residents. She said it gently, almost like friendly advice, but the meaning behind it was clear. In her mind, the timeline for my departure had already begun. Daniel did not interrupt her or disagree. Instead, he quietly added that it might be practical for me to consider something smaller eventually since the house was more space than one person really needed. I remember looking at both of them across the table and realizing that they were not trying to be cruel. They genuinely believed they were discussing a logical next step. In their minds, the future of that house already belonged to them, and my role was simply to transition out of the way when the time came. I smiled politely and told them I would think about it, but inside I felt a calm certainty settle over me. That evening was the moment when the idea that had been slowly forming in my mind finally became a clear plan. If Daniel and Vanessa were so confident about what would eventually happen to my home, then perhaps the most fitting response was to make sure they received exactly what they had been talking about all along. They wanted the house so badly that they had already begun planning their lives around it. And once that realization settled into my mind, I knew the next step I needed to take would be a quiet visit to someone who understood the law better than anyone else I knew. I waited about 2 weeks after that Sunday dinner before I did anything about the plan that had begun forming in my mind. There was no reason to rush because patience has a way of sharpening decisions. One quiet Tuesday morning I drove downtown to a small brick office building where a man named Thomas Green had practiced law for nearly 30 years. Thomas had handled the legal paperwork when Richard and I refinanced our mortgage many years earlier, and I remembered him as someone who listened carefully before speaking. His office was on the second floor at the end of a hallway that smelled faintly of old carpet and fresh coffee. When his assistant led me inside, Thomas stood up from behind his desk and greeted me warmly. Clearly surprised but happy to see me again. We spent a few minutes talking about ordinary things before I explained the real reason I had come. I told him that I wanted to review my will. Thomas nodded and pulled a thick folder from a cabinet behind him. The document had been written years earlier when Richard was still alive, and at that time the plan had been simple. If something happened to me, the house and the majority of my savings would go to Daniel. That arrangement had once felt natural, the kind of decision parents make without much hesitation. Thomas read through the old document slowly and then asked what changes I had in mind. I looked around the office for a moment before answering because I wanted to choose my words carefully. I told him that my son and his wife had become very interested in the future of my house. Thomas raised his eyebrows slightly but did not interrupt. Then I said something that made him pause with his pen in midair. I told him that I wanted Daniel and Vanessa to inherit the house exactly as they had been hoping. Thomas leaned back in his chair and asked if there was anything else I wanted included in the document. That was when I explained the rest of my idea. Over the past few years, I had quietly refinanced the property to fund several things that mattered deeply to me. Part of the money had gone toward establishing a small scholarship fund at the local community college in Richard's name. Another portion supported a regional charity that helped families repair older homes after severe storms. Those decisions meant that the house itself now carried a significant mortgage balance that had not existed before. I watched Thomas carefully as I explained that I wanted the property transferred to Daniel exactly as it stood, including every responsibility tied to it. For a moment he studied my face, perhaps trying to understand whether I was certain about what I was asking. Finally he nodded slowly and began making notes. He told me that legally it was completely possible to structure the will in that way as long as the language was clear. I remember feeling an unexpected sense of calm as he spoke. My goal was never to harm anyone or create conflict. I simply believed that if people spent years planning around a particular reward, then it was only fair that they eventually receive it in full, with every detail that came along with it. I left Thomas Green's office that morning with a calm feeling that surprised even me. Most people imagine that changing a will must feel dramatic or emotional, but for me it felt more like finishing a long piece of careful work. The documents were clear, the instructions were precise, and Thomas promised that everything would be filed properly and stored until the day it was needed. Before I walked out, he looked at me and asked one more time if I was comfortable with the decision. I told him something that had become very clear in my mind during the previous few months. I said that I was not taking anything away from my family. I was simply allowing them to receive exactly what they had spent years talking about. Thomas nodded slowly, folded the new documents into the folder, and told me that whenever the time came the instructions would be followed word for word. The drive home that day felt unusually peaceful. The maple tree in my yard was just beginning to turn orange because autumn had arrived early that year in Ohio. I remember sitting on the porch for nearly an hour watching the leaves move in the wind and thinking about how many seasons that house had already seen. Richard had once told me that homes were like quiet witnesses to people's lives. They watched everything without speaking. Birthdays, arguments, laughter, and long quiet evenings all passed through the same rooms. That afternoon I realized that my house had been watching the changes in my family just as clearly as I had. Over the next 2 years I said nothing to Daniel or Vanessa about the visit to the lawyer. Life continued almost exactly the way it always had. They visited occasionally on weekends, and Vanessa continued making small remarks about improvements that could be made someday. Once she even joked that the kitchen cabinets would look beautiful painted white when the house finally became theirs. I smiled politely the way I always did, and Daniel laughed as if the future she described was already guaranteed. What they did not realize was that every time they spoke that way it simply confirmed that my decision had been the right one. I was not angry with them anymore. In fact, the feeling that replaced my earlier disappointment was something much quieter. It was certainty. I knew exactly how the story would end, and that knowledge made it easy to listen without correcting them. Months passed, then another year, and eventually the conversations about the house became so routine that neither of them seemed to notice how often they brought it up. Daniel even told a friend once that the property would eventually help secure their financial future. I happened to hear him say it while they were standing in the driveway one evening. I remember looking at the house afterward, at the porch where Richard and I used to drink iced tea during warm summer nights, and realizing that the future Daniel imagined was going to arrive in a very different form than he expected. The truth was already written down, sealed inside a legal document, waiting patiently for the one moment when every word inside it would finally be read aloud. I did not know exactly when the final chapter of this story would arrive, but time has a way of moving quietly until suddenly years have passed. Life inside the house continued in its familiar rhythm while the secret I carried remained locked safely inside Thomas Green's office. The maple tree in the front yard grew another few feet taller, the seasons came and went, and I slowly moved through my 70s with the same routines that had filled my days for decades. Daniel and Vanessa visited every few weeks, sometimes for dinner and sometimes simply to stop by on a Sunday afternoon. During those visits Vanessa continued speaking about the house with the same confident tone she had used for years. She talked about how charming older homes were becoming again and how buyers were paying more for neighborhoods with mature trees and quiet streets. Once she stood near the living room window and mentioned that if the property were ever renovated properly, it could easily become one of the most attractive homes on the block. Daniel agreed with her in the thoughtful way he often did, nodding while he looked around the room as if he were already imagining the changes they might make someday. I listened without interrupting because there was no reason to correct their assumptions. The truth had already been written and sealed. Long before that moment. Over time they grew even more comfortable speaking about the future as though the timeline had already been decided. One afternoon while we were drinking coffee on the porch, Vanessa mentioned that they might eventually move closer to downtown if they could sell their current house and use the money from my property as part of a larger investment. Daniel laughed and said that the location alone made my house extremely valuable. I remember watching the leaves move gently in the branches of the maple tree while they talked about numbers and plans that depended entirely on a future they believed was guaranteed. It was not anger that I felt while listening to them. Instead, it was something closer to curiosity. I wondered how people could become so certain about receiving something that had never been promised to them directly. That quiet confidence stayed with them year after year, and I never once gave them a reason to question it. I continued hosting holiday dinners, baking pies during Thanksgiving, and decorating the porch every December the same way Richard and I always had. To Daniel and Vanessa, everything appeared completely normal. They had no idea that the outcome they imagined had already been carefully shaped into something very different. Eventually the day arrived when Thomas Green called to tell me that the documents had been reviewed once more and that everything was still prepared exactly as I had requested. Hearing his voice on the phone reminded me that the moment when those pages would finally be read aloud was slowly approaching. And when that moment came, every assumption my family had been making for years would be placed directly in front of them in the form of a single sentence that none of them had ever considered. I remember the morning of the reading with a clarity that still surprises me. The sky over Columbus was pale gray and the air had that quiet stillness that often arrives before rain. Daniel and Vanessa arrived at Thomas Green's office about 10 minutes early, walking through the glass doors with the calm confidence of people who believed they already understood how the afternoon would unfold. I had asked Thomas to gather everyone together for the formal reading because I wanted everything to be handled properly and clearly, exactly the way legal matters are meant to be handled. His office looked the same as it had years earlier when I first sat across from his desk discussing the changes to my will. The same wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with neatly arranged folders, and the same soft lamplight gave the room a quiet professional atmosphere. Daniel sat down in the chair closest to the desk while Vanessa settled beside him with her purse on her lap. She glanced around the room with curiosity, but there was also something else in her expression that I recognized immediately. It was expectation. For years they had spoken about my house as though it were already a future asset waiting patiently for them. Now they believed they were finally about to hear the confirmation of everything they had imagined. Thomas greeted everyone politely and opened the folder that contained the document we had prepared together. His voice was steady and professional as he began reading through the formal language that always appears at the beginning of legal papers. Most people do not realize how many ordinary details are included in a will before the important sections appear. There were descriptions of personal items, instructions regarding charitable contributions, and acknowledgments of various accounts that had been organized over the years. Daniel listened quietly while Vanessa occasionally glanced at him with a small smile that suggested patience rather than concern. They were waiting for the moment when the house would be mentioned. I could almost see the anticipation building as the reading continued. Thomas turned another page and paused briefly before continuing. That was when he reached the section that mattered more than anything else in the room. He adjusted his glasses slightly and read the next sentence aloud with the same calm tone he had used for every line before it. But halfway through the sentence something changed. His voice slowed for just a moment as he reached the wording we had chosen so carefully. I watched his eyes move across the page and then stop. The room became unusually quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than ordinary silence because everyone senses that something unexpected has just appeared. Thomas looked up from the paper and then back down again as if confirming that he had read the words correctly. For the first time since the reading began, he did not continue immediately. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair while Vanessa's smile faded into a puzzled expression. They were waiting for the next words, completely unaware that the sentence Thomas had just read contained the truth they had never once considered during all the years they spent planning their future around that house. Thomas Green looked down at the page again and then continued reading the sentence slowly, making sure every word was clear. He stated that the property located on Maplewood Drive, including the house and the land it stood on, would indeed be transferred to my son Daniel Whitmore exactly as described. For a brief moment Vanessa's small smile returned because those first words sounded exactly like the outcome they had expected for years. But Thomas did not stop there. He continued reading the full legal language written beneath that line, explaining that the transfer of the property also included the complete responsibility for the outstanding mortgage balance attached to the home, along with all financial obligations connected to the refinancing agreement filed in recent years. The number he read next was precise and impossible to misunderstand. $640,000. The room fell completely silent. Daniel blinked as if he had misheard the figure while Vanessa slowly turned her head toward him with an expression that no longer looked confident. Thomas kept reading because that was his job, carefully explaining that the will transferred the house exactly as it stood, meaning every legal and financial condition attached to the property would move with it to the new owner. I could see Daniel trying to process what he was hearing. For years he and Vanessa had spoken about the house as though it were a prize waiting at the end of a long timeline, but now the details they had never asked about were sitting directly in front of them in plain language. Thomas then read the next section, which explained where the rest of my estate had been directed. The scholarship fund at the local community college carried Richard's name and would continue helping students long after I was gone. The regional housing charity would receive additional support for families rebuilding their homes after severe storms. Those were the decisions that had made the refinancing necessary in the first place. Daniel finally spoke, asking how the house could possibly carry that amount of debt. Thomas answered calmly, explaining that refinancing a property for charitable contributions was completely legal and properly documented. Everything had been reviewed, signed, and filed years earlier. Vanessa sat very still while he explained it, the confident energy she once carried replaced by a quiet disbelief. I watched them both carefully, but I did not feel anger or satisfaction. What I felt instead was the same calm certainty that had guided my decision from the beginning. They had spent years imagining what their future would look like once the house became theirs. Now that moment had finally arrived exactly the way they had hoped. The property on Maplewood Drive belonged to Daniel Whitmore just as they always expected. The difference was that for the first time they were hearing the complete truth about what that ownership actually meant.